Hello, Northlanders. It's Dan Williamson. This past week, the Superior Telegram released its 18th episode of Archive Dive, which is a monthly history podcast that is hosted by Telegram reporter Maria Lockwood. Each month, Maria and a local historian dive into the archives of historic events, people, and places in Superior and Douglas County. For this month's episode, we explore Superior Central High School. The school, which opened in 1910, educated a roster of famous students, including football legends Ernie Nevers and Bud Grant, author Gordon MacQuarrie, photographer Esther Bubley, and America's ace of aces, Major Richard I. Bong. The building itself made history in 1928 when it became the summer White House for President Calvin Coolidge. Despite a grassroots effort to save the historic building, it was torn down in 2004. Maria is joined by frequent guest Teddie Meronek, a retired librarian and local historian, as they look back at the history and impact that the school, its staff, and students had on the community. Meronek co-wrote a book titled Central A to Z, The History of a Superior School. While not a student at Central, she was one of many supporters who tried to save the building.
Why was Central torn down, and how did that process go?
I thought it was important to support it because, the Wisconsin Historical Society doesn't put up a marker in front of a building unless it's important. And there was one in front of Central designating it as the Summer White House. And there was just something so iconic when you knew the history of it and you knew the people who had gone to school there. And you're thinking, what did they have in the water at Central? Why, there's all these amazing people who came out of that school.
Teddie also felt that the architecture made the building stand out.
Most people just probably drove by it every day, drive down Belknap, never think about it. But when you think about it, there's some of the best architecture in Superior. On Belknap, there was Central. Mm-hmm. There's the old courthouse. There's Hammond Avenue Presbyterian Church. There's the Masonic Lodge, which is now the Elks. And there's that great Belknap Electric Building, which was built as a duplex, back in the 1890s. Mm-hmm. And then you go down to Belknap and Tower and there's Globe News. And I thought, this is just a stupendous piece of, real estate here that has all these great buildings. And so to see Central go was really, really sad,
Also during this episode, Maria and Teddie discuss how Earl Barber won the competition to design the building and why well-known architect Carl Worth didn't. What name did the school start out as? The additions in the 1920s and 1930s, the contributions from Webster Chair Factory owner Andrew Webster, the significance of the James J. Hill statue out front, the story of Lulu Dickinson and a strike, Principal Clifford Wade and the tributes after his death, the Summer White House, and what other future presidents visited Central High School, how was Central used after Superior High School was built, the Central and East rivalry, and much, much more. You can find that episode at superiortelegram.com or wherever you also get this podcast. I'll also put a link in the show notes. In case you missed last month's episode, I'm resharing it here. In June, we featured the founders of Gordon, Antwine and Sarah Gordon. Maria was joined by Antwine and Sarah's great-great-grandson, Doug MacDonald, as well as Brian Finstead, both of the Gordon Wascott Historical Society, as MacDonald shared stories of Antwine and Sarah that were passed along in his family. I encourage you to take a listen, and when you're done, click the link in our show notes to find more episodes of Archive Dive.
Hello, and welcome to Archive Dive. I'm Maria Lockwood, a reporter with the Superior Telegram. Each month, we dip into files on historic events, people, and places in Superior and Douglas County with local historians. Today's podcast will focus on Antwine and Sarah Gordon, who founded the town of Gordon. The couple played a key role in growing the community following the end of the fur trade era. Their 1858 log cabin, which served as a home, trading post, and hotel for the stagecoach line, is listed on the Wisconsin Register of Historic Places. Helping us dive into the story today are Antwine and Sarah's great-great-grandson, Doug MacDonald, and Brian Finstead, historian with the Gordon Wascott Historical Society. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. As Antoine and Sarah's descendant, what are some of the stories that you grew up with, Doug?
Oh my gosh, there's so many from my grandfather and from my mother and from my great-grandmother. They really, really loved the family, loved the history, and loved to talk about it. And there was so many, there's not enough time to tell it, actually.
What are your favorite Antoine and Sarah stories?
Well, I guess the best, and the way Grandpa described it, was when Antoine went to Hole in the Day, his cousin in Minnesota. That's the most memorable story. He walked from Gordon to Leech Lake area. And Grandpa said when he walked into his lodge, he had a walking stick and he held it up and he feigned like he was going to give him a swat with it. And he said, "Ish and a moosh," which in Chippewa is kind of a bad thing to say. In other words, you bad dog. Oh. And Hole in the Day said, "Why, cousin, what's wrong?" And the story goes that he persuaded him not to join with the Sioux. This was during the New Ulm massacre. And apparently he prevailed because it didn't happen. But that's the one I remember most. But there was a lot of other personal ones where he talked about other Indians that he knew in Gordon and different things. But that by far is the most memorable one.
Right.
Because he was so animated because it was his dad, William Gordon, who was 12 at the time, walked with Antoine, and then Antoine had second thoughts. They got about halfway, and he told William, "Nah, you better go home. I'm going to make the rest." Can you imagine a 12-year-old walking in the 1860 wilderness by himself?
He made it home?
He made it home.
Wow. How important was where Antoine and Sarah set up their home? And how did that lead to Gordon, the town we know today?
Well, it was always an Indian village. And I know I can almost recite the names from hearing them from my mother, who heard them from her grandmother. That was a big factor. And plus, you had the confluence of the St. Croix and the Eau Claire right there. And the Gordon post office, where it's at right now, basically, if that railroad wasn't there, the river's only a couple 100 feet away. So it was really at a choice location. And that's where he built his trading post.
Was the railroad there yet?
No, 1907 that went through.
Okay, and he built the house in
1853, what we figure from my great-grandfather. He said he was 3 when he came there, and he was born in 1850. And it's a log house, and it's still pretty good shape yet.
It is. And they were able to work with the loggers in the area? Is that where?
Well, that and the Indians. And I have a good source, Uncle Ben, who knew Antoine, and Uncle Ben died in 1989. He lived quite a long time, but he was just wonderful, a great man. And he said Antoine was so good to the Indians. He said they'd buy on credit, and he said they couldn't pay later, and he'd just write it off, say that's okay. But Uncle Ben said he was very, very generous to a fault with the Indians. But he did a lot of lumber company business, haying. He put up a lot of hay. He didn't himself. He had workers, of course, and sold it to Musser Santry and the big companies. And he they had a farm there. Believe it or not, the village of Gordon was pretty wide open. I've seen 1880 pictures of it. And he had big fields of potatoes there. And I know my grandfather said he worked on it. And he always called it the farm. Gramps as well when I worked on the farm, But he was quite an entrepreneur. He was into a lot of things. And he really only had not even a 6 months education, but yet he spoke 5 languages: Latin, Sioux, Chippewa, English, French. And speaking of French, Uncle Ben, like I said, who knew him, said he had a slight French accent because, of course, his dad was full-blooded French, and he probably picked it up, but Uncle Ben said he had a slight accent.
And he had done many things prior to coming to the Gordon area. And he came there from Madeline Island?
Yes. He was born in Sandy Lake, Minnesota. His dad, Jean-Baptiste Gordon, Frenchman, married the sister of Hole in the Day, the elder. Her name was Awanishan, which you see in the books say young beaver, but technically it means a 2-year-old beaver, which I guess is young. So, but yeah, she went by that name. And then she was baptized Carolyn. And they moved to Madeline Island from Sandy Lake. And that's where Antoine basically grew up. He studied for a while with that Hungarian priest, I never can pronounce his name, Baraga or Baraga. I don't know how they pronounce it, but that's who he was an altar boy for him. And then he had about 3 months education with him, but yet he learned Latin from being so church-oriented.
And he was a devout Catholic, right?
He was very devout, yes. And he's a pretty smart guy for his education and person of the world, I guess he became.
Definitely. How did he meet Sarah?
They met on Madeline Island. That's a whole long story right there.
Give me the Cliff's Note version.
Okay. His wife's mother, her name was Isabella LaPrairie. She was born about 1803 in Fall of Vaughan. That's south of Danbury, trading post. Well, then she married an English trader named Daniel Dingley, and they were married for 15 years or so. But anyways, he went out hunting one day, never came back. They found his rifle and where he was sitting on a log, but that was in 1836. Well, then Isabella LaPrairie, whose name was Mushkodince, which means little prairie, she took the family to Madeline Island, and apparently that's where Sarah met Antoine.
And when they moved to Gordon, did they have any children yet?
Let me think. Ed was born on Madeline Island, and my great-grandfather was born on Madeline Island. Yep, that had 2. Yep.
All right. What brought them to the Gordon area?
He was up and down the St. Croix trading in years past, and so he thought that's a choice spot, apparently, and apparently it was.
He chose well.
Yep.
Excellent. Brian, what do you want people to know about the significance that Antoine and Sarah have on the Gordon area? And how do you see their legacy still today?
Oh, boy. I think they're just some of the most interesting historic figures of the area. In their time, they had wide influence. You know, they were so well connected, if not related to, you know, people in sort of fur trade era society and, you know, the local native communities. Their story is just a really compelling story. They moved around a lot. They were well connected, you know, had a lot of interesting events and, you know, founded the best town in Douglas County.
Yeah.
Best town in Douglas County. Ooh, gauntlets thrown. Where do you see their influence most today? When you look at the town of Gordon, where do you say, aha, I see Antoine and Sarah's hand there?
I feel like Gordon's always had a bit of a spirit about it.
That's it. I was going to say that. Yes. Yeah. Right. They do. They have a camaraderie, I guess. And it seems like everybody keeps coming back.
Yeah.
You know, even my great nieces and nephews come from the East Coast, you know, and everybody filters back and hangs out, and yeah, they love it, and it's a good atmosphere.
Yeah. He was very community minded. I mean, he founded a mission that became the Catholic Church, and he started the first school. And when there was a smallpox outbreak, he personally bought vaccine and vaccinated the whole upper St. Croix.
Really?
He just had this real...
Yeah, 1881.
Yeah. He just had this really, you know, he's like the first postmaster and just very...
School board. Yeah.
Community-oriented, active. And Gordon's always just been, comparatively for its size, just a very active community. And you can kind of trace that all the way back to Antoine and his descendants. Doug has done so much for the town.
Because you are also on the Historical Society, right, Doug?
Yes.
I mean, you were involved with starting it.
1978, yes.
Yeah.
It's been a while, and it's really grown. And we've accomplished at the Historical Society some really neat things, moving the museum, the depot. What else, Brian? What am I forgetting? Saved the fire tower, saved the post office.
And you feel that all of that can trace its way back to just how Antoine was able to unite people and bring the community together?
And the direct line between Antoine and Doug. I mean, there were so many generations of Doug's family that all stayed in the community, stayed very active, involved in the community, and all lived together or in very close proximity to each other.
Sure.
And you were just telling me earlier that you now own Antoine and Sarah's log cabin, right?
Right, yes.
That they built way back when they moved there first. What's it like to have that and to walk into that space?
Oh, it's pretty cool, isn't it, Brian? It's like stepping back in time. It's really neat, and you have a feeling that you're surrounded by history and people, and yeah, I know Brian and I will go, hey, Antoine, we'll go in there.
Really?
Right. And by the way, his name was Antoine. People say Anton, Antoine, but my grandpa called him Antoine, and if grandpa called him Antoine, that's it. And then I see on old census, they phonetically put it Antwine, so it's Antoine.
Definitely. And was it a big fight to get the house itself listed on the historic register?
Not really. We had big help. Brian's friend Janet, yes, and got this lady named Kelly from Madison, and it took over a year, but it's pretty neat to have that because it was a stagecoach stopping in the 1860s and late 50s. And I know I'll sit on the porch. I know my sister can't get over it. She goes, just think, stagecoaches were stopping here. And but yeah, it is pretty cool.
Is it very changed? Has it been added onto over the years?
Basically, not really. I don't believe it has. I changed the upstairs a little, but that was just refurbishing the knotty pine and like that.
It hasn't changed much since you've owned it. When it was first built, it's changed a lot.
Oh yeah, there are actually two log houses butted together.
Oh, really?
That's what it is. Yeah.
Okay.
My grandpa was born in it in 1874, and Father Gordon and 5 of the 7 kids were born in that house. But around 1882, they butted another log house up next to it.
Okay.
And that's been its present configuration.
All right.
And it's kind of neat when you see the archway. It's so huge because you can tell it's 2 of them are butted together.
How many children did Antoine and Sarah have?
5.
And which is your ancestor? Trace me your line.
Okay, Antoine, and then William Gordon, and his son Joseph, and that was my grandpa, his son Joseph.
Okay.
And then my mother, Catherine Gordon, and me.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that Antoine had a son who became fairly famous? Grandson who became fairly famous.
Yep.
Tell me a little about him.
Brian, do you want to?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, so
can't be all me.
Well, you tell it so well. So Philip Bergen Gordon was William Gordon's son.
Okay.
So brother to Doug's grandpa Joe. And he became a very notable Catholic priest. A lot of times he's referred to as the first Indian to become a Catholic priest, but he's actually, I think, the second. But he was notable, I think, for his advocacy. He was noted for being a critic of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and sort of championing rights of Native people very early on. He was on Calvin Coolidge's committee regarding American Indians. He fought the winter dam flooding that's now the Chippewa flowage. And he became so much of an activist that the Catholic Church got a little worried that he was more of an activist than he was a priest. And they actually removed him. He was at LCO. And they removed him from LCO and put him at a white farming community in Centuria, Wisconsin, because his Indian activism was kind of eclipsing his priesthood, which is sort of interesting. He was quite a rabble-rouser in character. And tell him about his famous friend in Ireland.
Oh, yeah, he had a friend in Ireland. He became president of Ireland, Eamon de Valera. And he toured with Father Gordon raising money to basically, for lack of better words, fight the British. The Irish were rebelling, in Ireland, and which culminated in 1921 at the Easter riot where England gave up, basically. But yeah, he was a good friend of de Valera, and we've got pictures of Father Gordon with De Valera, and also one of De Valera wearing Father Gordon's headdress. So he knew some famous people. John, what's his name, that founded the AFL-CIO. I've got a picture of him with Father Gordon.
So quite an influence that Antoine's grandson
And he
left.
spoke, Father Gordon gave the invocation a couple times for Congress in his gallivanting, I guess you'd say, for getting around. But he did get around and got a picture of him in Rome with the Pope, and he was wearing his headdress there. And he was quite a guy. Like I heard him referred once as the Martin Luther King of his day, because not only Indian affairs, like Brian was saying, poor white mine workers and like that, laborers. John L. Lewis, that's the guy I'm thinking of.
That he met with and was pictured with and was friends with.
And was a friend.
So he knew a lot of influential people.
Right, he did.
And was able to bring his message. Wonderful. When people come and ask about Antoine and Sarah, what are the things that you tell them at the Historical Society?
Basically, everything we're saying to you. we tend to go off on a tangent.
Do you?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, so it can get pretty lengthy. Sarah, I've got a document. She couldn't read or write English. She had an X on this one document I have. Actually, her son-in-law was a witness. He signed his name next to her X. But quite a contrast from her husband, who could speak and write and everything, all that. And he had great penmanship. Brian, you've seen the letter that I have framed. It's just fabulous, flourishes and the way he signed it for his son. The letter was to his son. He said, "From respectfully, your loving, affectionate father, Antoine Gordon."
Beautiful.
I mean, instead of just writing Dad.
But I do have to ask about Sarah. What are some of the stories that you have about Sarah?
Tough life. She had that journey they made up to Madeline Island. It was from St. Joseph, Michigan.
Wow.
And with her mother, and they did it on foot. And with 5 kids, she was a tough old gal. Yeah, so Sarah, she was very involved in the trade because Uncle Ben said, she helped a lot and handled a lot of the fairs. For Antoine, he'd go off for a day or two and buy in trips and so forth. And she would run it. So she couldn't have been too, dense.
No.
She was a pretty sharp gal from what I've collected.
So she wasn't just there raising the children. She was helping with the business. And
Yep.
Well, that's good because we always hear about Antoine, but we don't hear about Sarah.
Yep. True. It's true.
But it takes 2 to raise a family and found a town.
And she was very active with her children, too.
Yes.
She was very supportive. I know that just from pictures and Grandpa talking. And, she really loved her grandkids and was involved in their affairs. And actually, I think they helped them out financially, too, because their husbands had set up businesses and such like that. And they got into businesses. And so there had to be a little help there somewhere.
Awesome. What am I missing?
I was going to mention the Algonquin.
Oh, yes.
The Algonquin.
So the Algonquin was one of the first commercial ships of significance on Lake Superior. And I think it was built in the 1830s in Ohio.
Ohio.
It predated the Sioux locks. And so they actually brought it over land on rollers into Lake Superior. And in any early writings about Lake Superior, the Algonquin is frequently mentioned. And the Algonquin's last owners were Antoine Gordon and Vincent Roy. And they were using it to haul lumber out of the mouth of the Bad River to Superior when Superior was first being built up. And I wondered for a long time why there's got to be trees everywhere. Why would you get lumber from the mouth of the Bad River? And then I realized that a man named Leahy had a sawmill there. And I imagine compared to trying to, take trees and saw them into boards by hand, when you could get a whole ship full of sawed lumber, that probably made a lot of sense.
Right.
So, and then the Algonquin sank.
They scuttled it on purpose.
Why?
it had a fire in it.
Mm.
I don't know how it started, but it wasn't seaworthy. So actually they sunk it in East End in Superior. I forget exactly what slip, but.
Is it still there?
Actually, Brian, go ahead, tell him.
So,
I told this story to Brian. He can tell it.
So people salvage planks from it and then would make things out of them. And I found some writings of people on the Brule River have different things that stayed in their families that they refer to in these writings that came from some historical ship on Lake Superior. And when I read that, I'm like, that's the Algonquin. And Doug has a shelf and a cabinet.
Yes.
Made
out of it.
Planks from the Algonquin, made by Jim Gordon, right?
Jim Gordon. He went to the old Nelson Dewey, not the one you see now, but the old one. And their shop class went and salvaged a lot of the oak timbers.
Did they have the kids diving in there? Or
I don't know who.
Oh,
I'm sure they didn't, but somebody salvaged it. And the kids were making projects out of them. Jim made a nice cabinet, and their family was living in East End at the time. That's why he went to Nelson Dewey. Then he made a shelf that holds plates, decorative things.
Oh, that's wonderful. And that's
made from the Algonquin, yes.
Now, you grew up in Superior, right, Doug?
Right, yes.
And when did you make it out to Gordon?
Actually, full-time, I built my house on the old spot in 1977.
What was it like moving to Gordon, to where your family was from?
It was kind of neat. I spent 2 winters in my great-grandmother's house, Tegaquays, and it was pretty tough. No water.
No?
No, gosh, no. She lived in it, no water, had an outhouse in the back. And I carried 5 gallons every day from Minong, where I was working out of for UPS. And then I worked on my house, lived in there, worked on mine.
I can imagine, things were even more difficult back in Antoine and Sarah's day.
Oh, my heavens, yes.
So,
even when you were living in Superior, his family also had a house in Gordon.
Oh, yes. We had Grandma's old house, which was built in 1856.
Okay.
And my house sits on that spot. I tore down the old log one of Grandma and Grandpa's in 1974. Then I built my log house on top of it, the spot.
Excellent.
And then my great-grandmother's was next to the log house, where she lived right next to my grandpa. So that's why my mother was so informed. It was only 15 feet away from theirs. And she said, well, I practically live there, spending time and visiting with all the old Indian characters, for lack of better words, in town, all the notables from over in the village, who, of course, all died off then.
Right.
But Mom grew up knowing them, and plus all the stories they had to tell of the different things that happened.
Well, that's wonderful. You should write a book.
And my wife keeps telling me to do that, and I keep saying, okay. Well, I'm 80 now, for crying out loud.
I think you better get going then. I want to thank you both for coming in today.
Sure.
I really appreciate it. And thank you for listening to Archive Dive. New episodes are available monthly at superiortelegram.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a topic you'd like us to explore, email me at mlockwood@superiortelegram.com.